thinking as I'm listening, we didn't have time to hear what each other was going to say. Each one was busy working on their own. But I'm finding it quite wonderful. I feel very honored to be in the UK. When I realize, and I'm thinking about Queen Victoria, I'm thinking about the Baha'i history of this country, I'm seeing so many friends who've been pioneering all over the world, and really it's an honor to be here. Makes me think and reflect. Plus, we have ancestors from your country, and that's also very interesting for us to be able to think that this is sort of from where our own ancestors came, and there's a connection there, and we're all doing the best we can all around the world now at this very important time of history. Following this review that Link has given about Baha'u'llah's proclamation to the world's secular and religious leaders, I would like to review together one story about the Bab in Isfahan in 1846, and another about Baha'u'llah in Akka in 1889. In both of these, the manifestations of God themselves foretell how their revelations will be spread and propagated. Each explains that it will not be through those same secular and religious leaders of whom we have just been speaking. To the contrary, this great privilege is reserved for another population entirely: the poor and lowly of this land, Iran, and the meek and lowly ones of the earth. I would also like to share some personal thoughts about how today it's our privilege to see some of the results of the sacrifices, devotion, and steadfastness of some of these meek and lowly in different parts of the world, as our faith begins to penetrate the soil of society, is witness to changes in culture, and reacts to the initial steps of community building. That's how I would like to work with my 25 minutes. So the first story is, of course, about Manucher Khan. I apologize in advance for all my pronunciation of the names. In the summer of 1846, 171 years ago, the Bab bade farewell to Shiraz and proceeded to Isfahan. As he approached the outskirts of the city, he wrote a letter to the governor of Isfahan, Manucher Khan, to inquire where should he stay. Sayyid Kazim, who accompanied him on this journey, delivered his letter to the governor. The letter was written with such courtesy and in such exquisite penmanship. Manucher Khan instructed the Imam of Isfahan, the foremost ecclesiastical authority of the province, to receive the Bab in his own home. And the Imam then requested his own brother to go outside of the town to meet and escort the visitor to the gate of the city. As the Bab approached, the Imam Jumayd went out to welcome him in person and conducted him ceremoniously to his house. Many honors were accorded the Bab at that time in Isfahan, and many were the proofs he offered, even miracles he performed in response to requests received during those days from various individuals. To name just a few of these honors and proofs, the people of the city gradually became enamored of him, and an unceasing stream of visitors flowed from every quarter to the house of the Imam Jumayd. The inhabitants would clamor after his bath water. They believed it had a special power to heal their sicknesses and ailments. He revealed, at the request of the Imam, a written commentary on the Surah of Wal Asr from the Quran 103. With astonishing rapidity and without the least premeditation. Those present were bewitched, and he also chanted for them. One of the mullahs remarked, "Peerless, and unique as are the words which have streamed from this pen, to be able to reveal within so short a time, and in so legible a writing, so great a number of verses as to equal a fourth, nay, a third of the Quran, is in itself an achievement such as no mortal, without the intervention of God, could hope to perform. This is a quotation from the Dawnbreakers. And again, in response to Manusher Khan's personal request, he demonstrated the validity of another passage, Nubuvat-i Khasi, and in less than 2 hours he wrote out 50 pages of explanation with the most refreshing and circumstantial inquiry into the origin, the character, and the pervasive influence of Islam. Manusher Khan himself then commented, "Members of this revered assembly, I take you as my witnesses. I solemnly testify to my belief in the reality of the superhuman power with which this youth is endowed, a power which no amount of learning can ever impart." He also elucidated various points of abstruse philosophical documents at the request of different individuals. And then you probably remember this story that at a banquet, a request was made of him that a childless couple might receive a blessing in order to have a child. He took a portion of the food he had been served, handed it to his host on a platter, and asked him to take it to the man and his wife. "Let them both partake of this. Their wish will be fulfilled." The wife conceived and gave birth to a daughter, and this same daughter was later married to the Most Great Branch. That is, the child born of that miracle was Munir Khanum, who later married Abdul Baha. This was an idea of what happened during those days when he was in Isfahan. The enemies were watching closely, however. The clergy was becoming jealous. The growing popularity of the Bab aroused the resentment of the ecclesiastical authorities. They firmly believed that unless they rose to stem the tide of a popular enthusiasm, the very foundations of their existence would be undermined. They eventually issued a written document, signed and sealed by all the ecclesiastical leaders of the city, condemning the Bab to death. At one point, in order to protect him, the governor, Manusher Khan, had soldiers march the Bab out of the city as if he were being taken to Tehran, but had him secretly marched back into Isfahan so that he could personally protect the Bab as his own secret guest. During that time in his home, the governor was able to serve him his meals and wait on him personally. We read about this period when he was in his home, and this is the particular statement that's so important. One day, while seated with the Bab in his private garden within the courtyard of his house, the Mutmamid, this is another name for Manusher Khan, taking his guest into his confidence, addressed him in these words: "The Almighty Giver has endowed me with great riches. I know not how best to use them. Now that I have, by the aid of God, been led to recognize this revelation, it is my ardent desire to consecrate all my possessions to the furtherance of the interests and the spread of its fame." And then he proceeds to outline to the Bab his plan. "It is my intention to proceed by your leave to Tehran, and to do my best to win to this cause Muhammad Shah, whose confidence in me is firm and unshaken. I'm certain that he will eagerly embrace it and will arise to promote it far and wide. I will also endeavor to induce the Shah to dismiss the profligate Haji Mirza Akazi, the folly of whose administration has well nigh brought this land to the verge of ruin. Next, I will strive to obtain for you the hand of one of the sisters of the Shah, and will myself undertake the preparation of your nuptials. Finally, I hope to be enabled to incline the hearts of the rulers and kings of the earth to this most wondrous cause, and to extirpate every lingering trace of that corrupt ecclesiastical hierarchy that has stained the fair name of Islam. And here is the response of the Bab. May God requite you for your noble intentions, the Bab replied. So lofty a purpose is to me even more precious than the act itself. Your days and mine are numbered, however. They are too short to enable me to witness and allow you to achieve the realization of your hopes. Not by the means which you fondly imagine will an almighty providence accomplish the triumph of his faith. Through the poor and lowly, through the poor and lowly of this land, by the blood which these shall have shed in his path, will the omnipotent sovereign ensure the preservation and consolidate the foundation of his cause. That same God will, in the world to come, place upon your head the crown of immortal glory and will shower upon you his inestimable blessings. Of the span of your earthly life, there remain only 3 months and 9 days, after which you shall, with faith and certitude, hasten to your eternal abode. The Mu'tamid greatly rejoiced at these words. Resigned to the will of God, he prepared himself for the departure which the words of the Bab had so clearly foreshadowed. He wrote his testament, settled his private affairs, and bequeathed whatever he possessed to the Bab. Immediately after his death, however, his nephew, the rapacious Ghurgan Khan, discovered and destroyed his will, seized his property, and contemptuously ignored his wishes. So we thus have the picture of Manushir Khan's personal plan and the Bab's personal and prophetic response to it. I'm now going to go to a story similar in nature, but it is about Baha'u'llah. So I'm going to be quoting from the Revelation of Baha'u'llah, Volume 3. When there was a gentleman named, let's see, this name is hard for me, Haji Shah Khalilullah, more or less. The son of Muhammad Beg, that one I can do. And from a spoken chronicle to some friends. So this is from the Revelation of Baha'u'llah, Volume 3. And this gentleman is explaining what happened when he and his father were in the presence of Baha'u'llah, because we are now in Akka at a much later time. One day, Baha'u'llah informed my father that he would be visiting us in the afternoon. That day, he arrived with a few of his disciples. We were both highly honored by his presence and immersed in the ocean of his grace and bounties. After some time, he arose to depart. We accompanied him to the door, and as he went out, he signaled to us not to accompany him further. I watched from behind his graceful stature and the majesty of his walk until he disappeared from my sight. I was so carried away, and in that state I said to myself, what a pity! If only the kings of the world could recognize him and arise to serve him, both the cause and the believers would be exalted in this day. The following day, when we attained his presence, he turned his face to me and addressed the following words to me with infinite charm and loving kindness. He said, and of course this is a paraphrase of the words, if the kings and rulers of the world had embraced the faith in this day, you people could never have found an entry into this exalted court. You could never have had the opportunity to attain our presence, nor could you ever have acquired the privilege of hearing the words of the Lord of mankind. Of course, the time will come when the kings and rulers of the world will become believers, and the cause of God will be glorified outwardly. But this will happen after the meek and the lowly ones of the earth have won this inestimable bounty. So, in this next part of what I wish to say, I had some personal thoughts and comments, thinking, of course, about this extraordinary 10-year period in the life of Baha'u'llah, when he spent all that time writing to the kings and the rulers and giving so much guidance for the future of the governing of the world, and really quite extraordinary aspects of our future. And yet how it was not they who actually ended up, quite to the contrary, with the exception of Queen Victoria. And then when we read what the Bab and Baha'u'llah both said about how their faiths will progress and will be propagated, that there will come the time when the kings and the rulers, and we've seen a very few examples of that, but we do have a few. But in general, it seems it's the poor, the meek, and the lowly that are given the inestimable privilege of proceeding with this process. So it was so clear to me, and when I was reading this story of the Bab in Isfahan, his power was so great. It was overwhelming. It was so obvious to the inhabitants of the city. The magnitude of the signs of his divinity were extraordinary and clear, transparent. The proofs that he offered in response to requests received from various individuals were so willingly shared, so overwhelmingly convincing. Even those who had requested them, the ones who had requested those proofs, even gave testimony themselves to their power, as you heard. Many were the eyewitnesses of all of these events. Yet, what happened? How would the cause be spread? Even with the willing assistance of as high-ranking an individual as Manouchehr Khan, the Bab was clear it would not be through power, through influence, through high-ranking individuals. So we know the ensuing history of the spread of the faith in Iran at that time. The tremendous, irresistible attraction of the people of the country to the Bab, the 20,000 martyrdoms that followed. And similarly, with the story of Baha'u'llah, the same principle is reiterated when he says it will be the meek and lowly ones of the earth. Now, naturally, our faith spreads and grows at different rates in different parts of the world. It's not a linear process. Today, I think we're quite fortunate because we are far enough after the initial revelation that we can begin to see, at least to some degree, how this pattern of growth referred to by the Bab and Baha'u'llah is now continuing to play itself out, first in Iran and then throughout the world. We can testify in these days to the stunning progress being made by the Baha'is, particularly in what one might call the developing world. In today's terms, many see these countries as less fortunate, unfortunate, but it seems, at least to me, that they are in some ways leading us spiritually. I find it sort of a mystery, a special blessing from God to certain areas of the world. Tomorrow, my husband's going to show a PowerPoint about the spread of the faith from 1844 to 1994. And I suggest that we look quite carefully at some of the graphs and the things that he's put together as they show what an extraordinary pattern of growth emerged in the 70s and the 80s when the faith really began to take hold in the developing world. Speaking from personal experience, as I mentioned earlier, for 21 years, from 1972 to 1993, we were pioneering in 3 of these countries, right smack in the middle of Africa, French-speaking Africa. And this was, we were in CAR and Cameroon and the Ivory Coast. Maybe I said it already. Things were pretty basic This is just to sort of give you an idea of how things had to start from nothing in some of these countries that are now quite excelling in what they're doing. We were pretty much starting from scratch, just electing a few local assemblies here and there. Our National Assembly had just been elected in the Central African Republic. We were trying to get the first children's classes going. I was trying very hard to work with the women and get to know the women, but they didn't speak French. They spoke the local language, which I didn't speak. So first we sort of worked through the gentlemen and then gradually persuaded them to bring their wives or the females so that we could start working with them. Principles of consultation, we had to work very hard because, of course, local assemblies and the National Assembly had to function according to what's in the writings, but this was really from the bottom up that we were trying to do this work. The laws, you had to go a little gently sometimes on the laws, but they had to be also explained. Only one wife, struggles with alcoholism, troubles with politics. I mean, phooey, the whole world went through this, right? When you go with the teachings of the faith and you need to gradually share them with wisdom and then hope and pray very hard that they will take hold and that some pure souls will arise to carry this faith on their own shoulders. The pioneers went to do a certain job, but it was only one stage of the thing, right? The beloved guardian always made it very clear that the point of going was so that the local believers would take hold of the faith and govern themselves and lead their countries. So we were in some of these places quite at the beginning of this process. And now you look and you can hardly believe it, but they had a lot of purity of heart, conviction of belief, tremendous commitment and devotion in spite of their rather wretched living circumstances. Every country we went to, we seemed to be living through a revolution, not a revelation, a revolution. And the first one was Bokassa, who some of you who are older, you may remember that name. So we lived through that revolution, and then we moved over to Cameroon, and then there was Ahidjo, and then he went, and then we moved over to the Ivory Coast, and there was Houphouët-Boigny, and then he went. And so everywhere we were going, there was this turmoil from many different points of view, not to mention the problems of health and of education and all of this. So you can try and get the picture of the environments in which this was transpiring, the beginnings of the movement of the faith. So years later, in 1993, we were invited to serve in Haifa. And as I was appointed as a member of the International Teaching Center, there was a fair amount of travel involved. And that was for 20 years. So I was able to travel back into those same countries for another 20 years. So that means from 93 to 2013, I was actually following the progress in some of these countries quite closely for over 4 decades. And the counselors of those countries naturally were and remain some of my best buddies and closest friends. And even now, I can't stand it, and so I just pick up the phone and I try and call and do a Skype and find out what's going on and how everybody is. And of course, this is 3 generations of people later. So all the people that were young, the way we were young when we went, they now all have children and grandchildren, and the entire situation of the faith has changed so much. So I remember one conversation. I wanted to share with you these conversations that I had with a couple of these counselors. One was a man named Tiati Azok from Cameroon. I don't know if any of you know Tiati, but just a wonderful individual with whom we served on committees and things when we were in Cameroon. And then how can you ever know what the future is? But then he was a counselor and we were in Haifa. And I remember discussing with Tiati after he was appointed a counselor and had been serving for quite a while. He said, Joni, we know what kind of countries we live in. We know, of course, that we're surrounded by corruption, by tribalism, by tremendous problems. If we don't pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, that was his term, however, we're not going anywhere. No one is going to rescue us. But as Baha'is, we can clearly see that this is the way out of the problem. And then he would explain, that's why we have to get this institute process going. That's why we have to pay such attention to the characters of our children and have this transformation. And then another similar conversation I had with another very close friend of 40, 50 years, Clément Fézouret, who is still the counselor of the Central African Republic. And he had the same kind of thing, but even with more detail and clarity. He said, he said, we can't count on our government. It's a failed state. We don't count on the clergy. And then he said there's a lot of illegitimate babies running around the quartier, and there's a lot of problems with the young people, and we're not counting. We know we can't count on that. We can't count on our tribal system anymore. The old people are left in the villages. The young people have gone into the capital city. The old people can't read. What could we possibly do with this sort of old-fashioned sort of thing? It's not the view of the future. And then he said, and the NGOs, some come that are good. He said, but some come and they take your money and they run away. They say they're going to build a well, but they don't. It's very difficult to have confidence in these different things. So he said, it's up to us. We know. We have to serve the faith with all our heart and all our soul to the best of our ability. There is no other choice. It's all about the covenant. And you remember, what was that video that showed 4 different clusters 5 years ago? Frontiers of Learning. Do you remember the guy from DRC who said, we keep our messages from the House of Justice in our back pocket? This is a reality, because this is life. This is their life. This is everything. So you begin to get the picture of why people absolutely cling to the faith, give it their all. They are convinced spiritually, and they don't have a lot of distractions the way we do. The only movie theater in Bangui was blown up. And so that was the end of that one. I used to take my kiddies there, to see a Walt Disney or something every once in a while. Then they blew that one up too. So I mean, it's a completely different scene. We're living in the United States. We have so many things that we could do and so many distractions, and truly the materialism is really a little bit rough. You have to watch on yourself all the time that you're not going to fall into that one. So you see that different societies have different challenges. We don't have revolution and all the rest of that over there in New Hampshire, but we have other things, so every part of the world is doing their best. But these poor and lowly, they did get this inestimable privilege. And if you look today, look at the houses of worship, where they are being built. This is a very interesting thing. These 2 national houses of worship, where are they going up? Question. Papua New Guinea and? DRC, exactly. All right, now, if you look at the United Nations list of countries with which to do business, these guys are at the bottom. There's no confidence, no honesty, trustworthiness. I mean, it's not advised at all. And so, yet these are the places where the Friends have taken the faith so much to heart that they have built up extraordinary things over the last 30, 40 years. I'll be talking more about this on, I think it's Wednesday, with some examples. And these local houses of worship, that's harder to name those 5, I think. But we know one is about to be inaugurated. What do we say? To be commemorated? Dedicated, thank you. So that one is coming up, I think, on the 1st of September. It's right away, and we've seen the pictures. So we know that also the Cambodians, I was there when we had those 41 conferences, remember, back in 2008? That was one of the ones I went to. Oh my gracious, they're the ones that have suffered all that terrible stuff there, with all the killings and all that war. I tell you, the whole population looked as if it was 30 and under. There just weren't any grandmothers around, and yet the way they had taken the faith and begun to rebuild everything they could was just extremely moving few days when I was there. Colombia, India, Kenya, and Vanuatu. So for me, I'm interpreting these and thinking that these really are the places where we have the meek of the earth. We have the last shall be first, for those of us who come from a Christian background. And I think one other example I wanted to give of the progress that has showed how these meek and lowly who were given this job is international conventions. Now, some of you who have been to international conventions over a series of years, I mean, that was one of my privileges. I was in Haifa right there watching them, and then before, when we were in Africa, we went to some of them. Wow, in the beginning, you know, I can remember back in the 70s and 80s, the delegates that would stand up and really speak at the international conventions were very much the ones who had the most experience at that time. And so you would have different ones from Europe, of course, the UK, which was also so respected, and France, the United States, Canada. Then places like Brazil began to speak up, and then South Africa began to speak up. But over the years, the last one I attended just before we left the Holy Land, it was extraordinary. The people line up behind the microphones, just so anxious to talk about the growth of the faith and the progress in their countries. But really, over 50% of them were in all kinds of robes and hats and, different delegates from these other areas of the world where such capacity had been raised up. And such devotion to the faith after these 30, 40, 50 years was now evident. I'm thinking that this really is one of the wonderful things that we can be telling people at the time of the bicentenaries, because this is living proof. We have now living proof. We didn't have it when I was a youth. But now you can even watch the videos, you can see the things, and you can read the stories, and I'm going to tell some of those stories on Wednesday, about what is happening as we watch the rest of the world. It's simmering along and bubbling. Most people haven't the foggiest idea, and even the Baha'is, I think, we don't know enough about those wonderful things that are going on. So I think in conclusion, I can say that we're seeing unfolding on a world scene what first happened in the time of Manouchehr Khan in Iran, when the faith began to spread among the poor and lowly, or whoever it was, of Iran at that time. So here we are now 171 years after the first story of Manouchehr Khan. And we are united at a world level by one common faith. And we have a similar educational process that is going on in how many languages throughout the world. We are speaking one language because of that similarity of this process. And we're all working to the next step, which we understand is community building and how to become solid at the local level, because we've decentralized to such an extent that we're now focusing on neighborhoods. You all heard Natalia Mann and the wonderful explanations last evening. Imagine the focus to be at that neighborhood level at this time, after what we've been through so rapidly in the last 50 years, with first people going to certain countries. So I think we have a great deal to be thankful for, particularly those of us who've lived this particular series of decades, because the change has been extraordinary. In October of 2017, how are we going to show our thanks? How are we going to prepare ourselves in order to do a good enough job? I think, as the House of Justice has said in its most recent Rizwan message, and what could be more fitting to offer the Blessed Beauty on the 200th anniversary of his birth than the earnest striving of his loved ones to extend the reach of his faith. Right? That's us. Teaching. May we each be worthy of the privilege of being alive and active as Baha'is at this particular historic point in time, capable of teaching and extending the reach of his faith. Thank you very much.